to get us started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me. As Penny said, I'm James Lush and I'm the Equality Charters Development Manager at the Equality Challenge Unit, and we run Athena SWAN. Next slide, please. So the outline for my little session will be that I'll do an introduction to ECU and Athena SWAN and the purpose of the charter mark, talk about the fundamentals of action planning, and then I'll cover very briefly how panelists view action plans. Next slide. So a very quick overview for those of you who may not be aware. Equality Challenge Unit works to further and support equality and diversity for staff and students in UK higher education institutions, and also works with colleges in Scotland. We take an evidence-based approach to our work, and we provide a central resource of advice and guidance to the sector. Our kind of overall mission is to support institutions to remove barriers to progression and success for staff and students. So we support the sector through our qualitative and quantitative research, providing information, advice and guidance, sharing good practice, running events, conferences, seminars and networks, operating an advice line, releasing a monthly newsletter called the Quality Link, which anybody can subscribe to. We offer training, consultancy and bespoke services, and we operate two equality charters, the Athena SWAN Charter and the Race Equality Charter. Start with a very brief history lesson about Athena SWAN. It was born as a recognition scheme of excellence in women's employment in STEM, STEM being science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine, and was launched in 2005 with 10 founder members. In consultation with the sector and following a trial of what we called the Gender Equality Charter Mark, we expanded the scope of the charter in May 2015. So we are currently still referring to the pre-May and post-May 2015 versions of the charter. And at this time, Athena SWAN became a recognition scheme of commitment to gender equality across institutions. And Athena SWAN has always been based on challenging assumptions, applicants to the charter interrogating their data and responding to these data. So this methodology isn't STEM specific, and the Gender Equality Challenge is not unique to STEM. So we saw that it was high time for expansion to what we have referred to as ASPL. So that's the arts, humanities, social sciences, business and law. At the same time, we wish to reduce the emphasis on Athena SWAN being seen as being about and for women only. So we routinely saw women predominating on self-assessment teams, despite the vast majority of themes explored in these teams and in Athena SWAN being applicable to everyone. So, for example, women may disproportionately benefit from fairer career breaks policies, but actually all colleagues will appreciate better policies on this and a whole range of areas. Excuse me. Part of the broadening of the charter means that now at institutional level, Athena SWAN specifically directs focus on the experience of trans people and intersectionality as well. And taking an intersectional approach means recognizing that people have multiple identities that may result in them having multiple disadvantages in their career. People's identities and experiences are unique, and we must recognize this when we're considering equality, diversity and inclusion. Essentially the principle is that neither women nor men are homogeneous groups, and we need to take account of that in the actions that we implement. Next slide, please. So this leads nicely into an overview of our principles, which I'll abbreviate into main themes, these being we need to utilise the talents of everyone. There are systemic, structural, cultural and everyday barriers that perpetuate inequalities. Commitment and action from everyone is needed, especially leaders. Individuals must be rewarded fairly with due regard given to factors that have restricted their earlier opportunities. And people are not all the same. And the purpose of Athena SWAN is to provide a framework for a range of applicants of whatever size and situation they have currently to improve gender equality in line with these principles. Next slide, please. So in practice, this boils down to Athena SWAN being about equality in action. So that is showing a commitment to removing barriers and taking a self-critical approach to identifying these, and then taking a targeted approach to addressing these. It's not about producing a shiny report. It's not about suggesting what solutions might be, but actually committing to them. And it's not about platitudes. So, for example, a statement that we show considerable commitment to something, whereas the evidence suggests that this commitment is not being shown. And to be assured of a practical, targeted approach, the action plan is absolutely fundamental. Athena SWAN is a journey, and at bronze level, which is the first award level, we need commitment and a clear starting point. And if there's capacity to change and a robust plan to do so, the award will be achieved. Next slide. Athena SWAN works because the self-assessment process we require is exhaustive. We require applicants to collect quantitative and qualitative data, to critically analyse these data, to identify the reasons for exclusion and underrepresentation, to develop a 4-year action plan to address these, and to show progress over time. It's much more than box ticking. So whilst Athena SWAN has driven certain practices such as mentoring and unconscious bias training to become more widespread, we don't have a list of essential practices and criteria, because we believe that it's important for every applicant to have autonomy over what it chooses to implement. So as long as there is this link that links the data with the analysis and a robust action plan, that's what we're looking for. Next slide, please. Again. So the action plan gives the project its purpose. It's the kind of mechanism through which you drive change and commit to deliver this change. And the Athena SWAN mantra is that the action plan needs to be smart. So that is specific, what you're going to do and how, and who's responsible. Measurable, how will you measure the effectiveness of these actions? Achievable, so ambitious but realistic, with targets based on meaningful modelling of the current data points. Relevant, so prioritising pertinent issues rather than implementing pet strategies. And time-bound, and so we're talking about when the action will be implemented, but also when review and evaluation will take place. I'll just very quickly mention that we do have departmental and institutional awards, and this means that actions should be complementary between the action plans associated with these awards. We are not asking departments to reinvent university policies. Rather, the university action plan should provide a base for departments to build on. So there's much more scope for departments to be much more specific regarding day-to-day practices and people's experience, and that these departmental actions will be discipline and departmental specific in a way that the university action plan cannot be. Next slide, please. The action plan should be a live document that covers objectives, rationales, the actual action proposed, timeframes, responsibilities, the current baseline data, and the success measures. Essentially, the plan needs to stand alone. Sorry, can you just return? If the or self-assessment team or committee that's looking after the action plan turns over, or people leave the institution, it should still be clear what will be done, how, and what developments are sought. Next, thank you. So I've discussed already that an analysis should link directly to actions, and I've just presented a couple of examples from submissions on this slide. So in the first extract, this isn't done. There's no indication of what the applicant has concluded is the issue requiring action, and there is no indication of what these 7 actions are. Conversely, in the second extract, relevant quantitative and qualitative data are summarized into issues arising, and these are then responded to in a concrete manner, and what we will do about it. Next slide. Actions don't need to be exciting, but they must be truly active. So unsuccessful applicants to the Charter will submit passive action plans which emphasize monitoring and further review, despite data already having been collected and unequal outcomes being seen. There's no imperative to reinvent the wheel, as long as actions are implemented in context. So there is no shame in copying or borrowing actions that have been successful elsewhere. We strongly encourage applicants to talk to each other and talk about strategies that have worked for them. Where actions are innovative, they should still be evidence-based and tested. Next slide, please. So I'll devote some time to taking you through an example. And so headline data in this department are that women in Department X rarely apply for promotion. And further investigation, as shown through the data on the slide, suggests that at least partially this is about understanding. So 43% of all staff and 52% of women specifically report a poor understanding of the promotions criteria. So here it's not an issue that's unique to women, but it is disproportionately affecting them. This is a typical example of data that should trigger the development of action. Next slide. So if we look at, we transpose that situation onto the Athena SWAN methodology. Department X is at the 3rd step of the process illustrated here. So they've collected data, they've analysed data, and now they need to identify the reasons for the issue, define actions, and develop an implementation plan. So at this stage, Department X should be carrying out a literature review, looking at successful practice from elsewhere, and maintaining engagement with their colleagues to delve more deeply into their experiences. And doing these will greatly enhance their understanding of the issue, and this will thus help them to develop evidence-based actions and identify measures to evaluate outcomes and impacts. Next slide. So our fictional department decides to implement an action to demystify the promotion process through a workshop. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So they need to then translate that idea into their action plan. So it isn't sufficient to simply state that a workshop will be run, even if the rationale for doing so has been given. As well as stating this action and rationale, They also need to include the timescale over which they will carry this out, who will be responsible, and success measures that relate back to the original motivation for the action. Again, rather than workshop is run, it needs to be much more than that. Unsuccessful applicants have a tendency to present broad actions as one large activity. But if actions are genuinely complex, then they need to be staged in terms of activity and outcome milestones. And the other key element that unsuccessful applicants fail to do is set quantified targets. And it's absolutely essential for the process to think about targets as performance indicators, that if you're not meeting, you may need to reassess the actions. Otherwise, you can find yourself with a completely fully implemented action plan, but no actual positive outcomes against what you intended to effect in the first place. Next slide, please. So revisiting Department X, they define timescales for when their workshops will be held, and when and what they are going to evaluate, and whether they meet this timescale becomes part of their evaluation too. Next slide. In their success measures, they include measures that relate to different types of evaluation. So the process will be a success if all staff attend the workshops. They state that the outcome will be judged successful if 80% of women, compared to remembering that earlier it was more than half stating a poor understanding. If 80% of women report now having a good or very good understanding of the promotion process. And there will be impact if there is an actual increase in the proportion of women who apply for promotion, which was the original underlying issue that they were targeting. So in this case, next slide, we see that 30% of women apply for promotion in the 3-year period post-intervention, compared to 10% in the previous period. Next slide. So I'm going to close by briefly considering the panel review process. All applications to the Athena SWAN Charter are reviewed by a panel. And as I say, we give applicants and panelists guidance, but this isn't a formula for success. As I say, applicants have the autonomy to define priorities and responses. So therefore, there being discretion in what applicants can choose to do, there is also discretion in how panels will view what has been proposed. So it's important to understand the review process. So mechanistically, we have 2 rounds per year, and we assign 5 reviewers to review a subset of applications. Our reviewers are then drawn from a database of volunteers from the sector. They self-declare their interests and they agree to confidentiality. And then a chair is drawn from the panel. The chair will be the most experienced panelists. And all panelists are trained via webinar and chairs are trained in person. Next slide. So that being the kind of technical perspective. From a human perspective, reviewers are your peers. So they are aware of higher education and research and the structures and norms in these sectors. And this means that they will generally be perceptive of obfuscation. The majority of the panel will usually be academics, so at least 2 of the 5 and usually 3. And this means that these people are detail conscious and their whole training is geared towards being critical thinkers. They are engaged people, so they are likely to be involved in a self-assessment team themselves and making submissions themselves. So they will understand the difficulties you have in producing an effective action plan, but there is a good chance that they will have made progress in their own institutions and departments, and the attitude therefore is that you can too. They are committed, so they want to see change because they're committed to the agenda, and that means they want to see commitment from applicants rather than tentative statements and unambitious targets. They are dedicated, so it takes a long time to prepare for a panel and reading numerous submissions, and this takes a lot of care and attention, and they expect applicants to take the same care and attention over the submissions. And lastly, they are believers in Athena SWAN, and they value the Equality Charter standards, and they want to see these upheld. And essentially, reviewers will be assessing the fitness for purpose of the processes you've undertaken and the action plan produced. So the award comes as for a valid action plan, not as a reward for the effort of the self-assessment team. Next slide. Remembering the characteristics I've just outlined is useful when considering things to avoid. So there's some common pitfalls that applicants will fall into. So applicants may have no clear goal for their actions. It can be actually unclear, having read a 50-page submission and a 20-page action plan, what the applicant actually hopes to achieve. And the question becomes, what is the point in this applicant having engaged in the charter? So you must state what you are hoping to achieve. Applicants may not reach conclusions about their data, so the data analysis will not conclude. And in these cases, the panel will be led to question whether the applicant is in a position to deliver actions. Applicants may not prioritize, so the panel will be looking to see that efforts are aligned to what is needed rather than what is maybe easy. Applicants may not respect the expansion of the charter. So as I mentioned, this particularly applies to professional and support staff, and all departmental applications should need to consider professional and support staff. However, a recent theme since we expanded is that professional support staff have been seen as an afterthought. And as well as not respecting the expansion of the charter, this also means that the applicant isn't respecting their colleagues, including those that will be on the panel, because the panel won't be entirely academics. Applicants may also not evidence buy-in, so the panel will be looking to see who's engaged and whether this is a genuine group effort. And again, remembering that the award is for the department, not for the self-assessment team. So they'll be looking to see whether the plan is strategic and has the necessary buy-in that will enable the self-assessment team to actually implement and deliver the plan without facing fights at every step. And lastly, applicants may define impact as in terms of achieving or obtaining better, more accurate data sets or improving processes. And as I mentioned, in themselves, these are not representative of real change. Again, we have to remember why and go back to the principles. Why did we develop Athena SWAN in this way? What are the things we wish to achieve? The things we wish to achieve are not clearer data sets. We wish to deliver real change and advance equality. Next slide. So that brings my section to a close. There's a lot of information on our website, and again, you will be able to access these slides later. and I and my team can be contacted via email at the address on screen. So thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, James. Lots of very valuable content and insights in that presentation there. So please do put any questions that you have in the question box, and I'll start to put those to James. I do find it rather scary that such a huge amount of time and effort can go into a submission and the reviewers still can't see a clear goal. Because there are teams of people working on these, so yes, thank you very much for your guidance around this then, James. So we've got some questions coming in now. I'll put them to you, James, and hopefully they're not too tricky for you. Okay, so there's a question here. With respect to professional services staff that you've just mentioned at the end of your presentation here, so with respect to professional services staff that are not within the influence of the decisions taken at department level, but have a separate reporting structure, would there be penalties for not setting actions that affect these staff members directly?
Sorry, my mic on? Yes, it is. No, there wouldn't be penalties for not. I mean, a department can never be expected to have actions that are for things that it itself cannot implement. But the department should still be, if there are professional and support staff working in the department or with the department on a day-to-day basis, they will still be interacting with and experiencing the culture of the department, and so it's still relevant for the department to consider how these staff, even if they aren't their direct reports, experience the culture of the department, and there may still be actions that can be implemented. But if it's specifically regarding, you know, management and career development, and there is no influence that the department can have, then of course there would be no penalty.
And you probably answered this second question then, which is also related to support staff. This question says, in our university, the support staff are separate from the department. They're centrally located and are not associated with any specific department. So how can this be addressed?
Well, that is the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, these staff should then be captured in the institutional level submission, which will be complementary.
Okay, more questions coming in. Some here relating to data. So I might read both of these questions to you, James, because I think there'll be some overlaps around them. So is seeking more quantitative data as a route to affecting change a valid action point? And also, can you specify what you mean by baseline data information?
Yes, so, okay, seeking, if it's quantitative, so there are specific sets of quantitative data that we request as part of the application process. And whilst there is an acceptance that not all applicants will necessarily be able to obtain complete data set, all of these complete data sets before a submission, perhaps because of institutional factors outside their control, there is if the action plan is geared towards just collecting these data that are acknowledged they don't yet have, then that is unlikely to be seen as sufficient, because the real crux of the matter is what is done in response to these data. If it's data that we don't request, but the self-assessment process has suggested may be useful to look into. So we've had this before the expansion. We never asked about grant applications and success rates, for example, whereas some applicants were finding that actually this was there were significant gender gaps in the values of grants being applied for, so they were going down and proposing to investigate that. This for that kind of further investigation would be an acceptable part of an action plan. With the intention, given the department's clear intention in that case to do something with that data. I've forgotten the second part of the question.
I was just scrolling it because there's a load more questions are coming now. Could you specify what you mean by baseline data information?
Baseline data. So essentially the current situation. So the plan will state where you are now and where you want to get to. I think there's. I'm just trying to think of a pithy example. If it's a engineering department where the proportion of female undergraduate students is actually already in excess of the national benchmark, then to state what the current it's tempting oftentimes for applicants to state that the success measure will be that the national benchmark will be exceeded, whereas in this case that is already exceeded. So if you state in the action plan what the current data are, then it becomes very obvious that simply to exceed the national benchmark is not a valid target, because that has already been achieved. It's just to clarify the journey that is being travelled and what success would look like.
Okay, lots of questions coming in about data now. Here we go. What would you recommend as an action if there are challenges with the quality of data? Not quantity now, it's a quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there are significant doubts about the validity, I mean, I assume we're talking about things like accuracy of data, then there is the point at which you need to say that the data, making the data reliable is a precursor to actually making a submission. I think it should be recognized that the self-assessment process needs to be responsive to what you find in the process of undertaking the process. So if you're finding that the data appear to be inaccurate, then that's a point at which to focus on actually perhaps delaying and ensuring the accuracy of that data before basing an entire submission on data that may be invalid.
Yeah, or incorrect. Yeah. Thank you, James. There are more questions about data, but I think you've probably covered a lot of those in the things that you've just mentioned in the last kind of 3 questions. So another question here about somebody's asked where they can obtain access to up-to-date benchmark data. The latest that appears to be on the website is 2015.
Yes, so ECU publishes annual statistical reports, and we get our data from HESA. Anybody from an institution that is a subscriber to ECU, which is almost all of the universities in the UK, can download these reports, but there is always a delay between between universities returning their data to HESA releasing it, and then ECU producing these reports. So it's never possible to have completely contemporary benchmarking data, although year on year it is quite rare to see drastic changes. So it doesn't mean that the data being from 14-15 or 15-16 will be invalid.
Yeah. We'll just perhaps take a couple more questions, as there's quite a long queue here, and I'll share them with you afterwards anyway, James.
Yeah, I can try to follow up later.
Yeah, absolutely. And we may have time at the end after Kate's spoken anyway. So is it better to be too ambitious and propose plans to attempt to make an impact and hit a target that you may not achieve, or choose a less ambitious target that is more achievable but will not have as much impact?
I mean, I would err on the side of ambition. An aspiration. There's nothing like an aspirational target to focus the mind, and that will be the view shared by panelists as well. So I think it's important to recognise that we require awards to be renewed on a 4-year cycle, and that renewal doesn't depend on you having achieved every single target that you suggested would be the appropriate ambitious target. I think it's better to have been ambitious and missed a few than to have been very tentative, and because I think tentative targets don't recognise the scale of the issues. I mean, obviously this is completely context specific, but we're talking about huge systemic issues here, and tentative targets can be viewed as tinkering around the edges, rather than actually, if it's a genuine whole department or whole institution commitment with senior level buy-in, then it should be possible to have ambitious targets.
So be aspirational and stretch yourselves.
Yeah, I mean there's no. I think the targets just have to be based on something meaningful. So again, it would be. I think applicants can be tempted sometimes to say, "Oh well, gender balance is the aim," but if you're talking about then committee representation and there's a 20% staff in the department are women, balance there isn't ambitious. It's just inappropriate.
Yes.
And likewise, if I think I'll stop there. But yeah, you see what I mean?
Yeah, see where you go. So final question, but I think this one might have some relevance to a number of people on the call. We're undergoing a significant restructure in our department, so our current picture is fluid and would expect to be after submission. How would you recommend presenting this in comparison to the 3 years of data required?
I mean, I think any department undergoing a restructure will have challenges regarding the how to go about the process. I think the researcher should be. We have a section right at the very start of the submission to provide context. And it's called description of the department, and to outline, exactly what the situation is, and I think why the department is still seeking to apply at this time, but that obviously it's will affect what can be committed to. I mean, the panel will take that context into account when looking at the submission. I think I would need to know more detail about the specific situation to give because I think all of these cases require very specific advice. So I suppose actually my answer is please get in touch with us.
Okay, and we'll be sure to share your contact details again with everybody, in addition to having it on the recording and the slide deck. So thank you, James. That's great. So we'll let you off the hook for now, and Kate, if you could join us. So this is just a reminder that Dr. Kate Carruthers-Thomas, who's Senior Research Fellow and Project Manager for Athena SWAN at Birmingham City University, is going to share Birmingham City University's approach and experience of using an action plan for their successful submission.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Thanks, Kate.
Okay. Right, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. And it's been really interesting listening to James. Always learning with Athena SWAN. So thank you, James, for all that information. So I'm going to talk about really more the process of how of action planning and how we put into practice putting together an action plan. So probably less detailed in some ways than James. And the first thing to say is that an action plan is obviously one element of the whole Athena SWAN application, but it's a really significant element. It's really a route map, I see it as, for the future, and it's also has to be a kind of living document, partly because of the fluidity that one of the questioners was just mentioning then, and we're all I think in HE really familiar with that. Birmingham City University is at an early stage in its Athena SWAN journey. We are not quite yet, thank you, Kath. We got a bronze award in May this year, and that was under the new framework. But the other insight I'm bringing, apart from having a very good memory of a recent memory of what happened and what we did, is that I'm a panelist, or have been a panelist, on several Athena SWAN committees, or panels rather, and so I'm bringing those insights as well. Okay, Catherine, thank you. Next slide. Great. So just a quick plan of what I'm going to cover. So I've structured it in that, looking at more generic points first of all, so the kind of lessons learned, and then more specifically as to what we did in practice. Then I'll summarise those and take questions. This is definitely not intended to be the way to do an action plan. The ECU is not particularly prescriptive around their action plans, other than the general guidance, and this is not intended to be prescriptive either. Okay, next slide please, Catherine. Okay, first of all I want to introduce myself in a bit more detail, because I have a slightly unusual role at BCU. I am the BCU Athena SWAN project manager, and I'm also a senior research fellow, so I am an academic member of staff. So it's a dual role. It's very rarely 50-50. Depends on the time of year, depends on what's happening. Importantly, I'm not an HR specialist. I do have quality and diversity experience within the higher education sector, but not in a professional role, more to do with LGBT actions around the Stonewall Diversity Index. But BCU, when they appointed me, they decided they wanted to take a kind of a research-informed approach to Athena SWAN and network it out from there. So put somebody in the faculties or in the faculty, and then network out from there. So that's quite different, I think, from a lot of universities in the UK undertaking Athena SWAN and how they're resourcing Athena SWAN. I am, as James showed on his thing about panelists, that kind of honeycomb sort of diagram, I'm definitely a believer in Athena SWAN. I'm also a believer that Athena SWAN is absolutely not about compliance. It's about cultural shift, and that is how you get the engagement sort of beyond the usual suspects. You know, the willing people who will turn up, most often female, to meetings, etc. So as the Athena SWAN project manager, I led the application for a Bronze Institutional Award. We made the application in November and were awarded in May this year, and I'm now engaged in the implementation of that action plan. I'm also, as I've mentioned, an Athena SWAN panelist. So I've taken part, I think, actually in 5 panels now. So that's covered both institutional and departmental applications and under both frameworks. As an academic, I'm researching gender and career currently in the HE sector, which clearly mirrors and reflects Athena SWAN issues and concerns. And I've been working in HE for quite a long time in a variety of roles, including professional services and academic roles. And some of you may know that I also write a blog called The G Word being gender, and the address is there. I don't post as often as I'd like to, or I should. Okay, next slide, please, Catherine. Okay, so lessons learned. Number one, there's going to be 3 of these slides. Developing the action plan. So the 3 slides will cover developing, designing, presenting the action plan as generic points, and there's obviously overlap between them. But the nature of this diagram is intended to convey that the action plan is an integral part of your application. It's not an add-on. So it's not something to be done in the final 2 weeks in a mad rush before you submit, although I totally understand people. I totally understand the time issues around getting an Athena SWAN application in. It will be easy for Athena SWAN panelists, or relatively easy for Athena SWAN panelists, to spot where an action plan has been added almost as an afterthought. It's important, therefore, to always keep actions in mind when you are working through the data, the analysis, the reflection, identifying the issues, etc. We're asked to produce a narrative in Athena SWAN in our applications, and I think of the action plan and the actions moving on from award, hopefully, as another narrative, or the narrative continuing. So the action plan is part of, as James said, that interrogation and response to data, and it is also, as James said, equality in action. So really important to allow time, for the action plan. I was really struck by that example that James just used about running a workshop around promotions, and how he showed the thought process that needs to go into that, the level of detail, the creation of a smart action out of that. So all of that does take a lot of time. Next slide. Designing the action plan. Okay, so the action plan is actually going to be read and used by a number of different audiences. Initially, it's going to be created and approved by the kind of key stakeholders in your institution, senior staff, etc. Those people who will be putting the plan into action in the future. It will then be seen by the panel, and it will then come back to those stakeholders and a wider audience within your institution to be put into practice. So it has a number of different audiences. So consider how it's going to be read by those different audiences. It's no point putting it all into the jargon of your university, the endless acronyms of all of our universities. I know there's a glossary you can put a glossary into the action plan, but it's important that it can be clearly read by all the audiences that it's going to. You need to understand when you're designing it how you're going to be reporting on it, how you're going to measure progress on it, and whether that actually works. In terms of literally structuring your action plan, there are different options. There's probably more than 2 options, but I've just identified the chronological structure. So as in application or section order. So as you go through, literally as you go through the application and the different sections and questions that are asked, that then generates actions. Or there is the option of doing a thematic action plan, and which will cross-cut across the application, cross-referencing different aspects more. And personally, I favour a thematic one. I think it avoids repetition. and I think it can be more institutionally intelligent, but I will also come back to that. You need to have an action plan that is designed to work in your context. I think we're all different sizes of university. We all have different, or departments. We all have different specialisms, different characteristics. There are small research centres, etc. So the action plan needs to work in your context. Next slide, please. Okay, and the third in terms of lessons learned, and this is actually very much from a panelist point of view, is please think of the panel when you're presenting your action plan. Most panels have 4 or 5 applications that they are adjudicating. The action plan is at the end of each of those applications. Yours might be the 5th one that is considered in that session, and therefore your action plan is the last thing that panel will be considering. It's a very, very rigorous process, and so people are pretty tired. That means that it's really helpful if you can signpost the actions throughout your application. You can do that in different ways. You can use colour, you can use codes, you can use boxes. There's lots of different ways, and there's lots of different examples of how you can do that. But it's about signposting your action plan or the individual actions as someone is reading through, because it's a lot to remember and to think back to and cross-reference. And what that means is if you've built up the sense of the action plan throughout the actual body of the application, once the panel member comes to the action plan themselves, it's almost like a second reading of it, and they can really then assess how smart the actions are, how relevant, etc. Keep it clear and simple. Try and avoid too many sub-actions, because they can get lost for the panel, and they might get lost as well once it's back in the institution being used. And be specific. Definitely avoid words like better, improved, and more, or at least don't leave them on their own without some kind of quantification of what you mean by that. So yeah, think ahead. Think ahead to how you are going to measure your success against this action plan. So as James was saying, you know, these are the constituents of a robust action plan, and one that will be able to show progress over time. Next slide, please, Catherine. Okay, I'm just having to press in these earplugs. In practice, so this is drawing more on our own experience at BCU, looking at perhaps some more specifics in a way to revisit the generic points I've just made. The first point there is that we use small working groups, including core SAT members and what we called expert members, which were drawn from elsewhere in the institution, to consider each section of the application. The way Athena SWAN tends to work in organisations is that often it is a small core of very dedicated, committed people, particularly in terms of an institutional application anyway, you know, especially at the beginning of the Athena SWAN journey. So those are the people that kind of get it going and do a lot of the work. But in fact, when it comes to actions in the future and to implementing kind of cultural shifts, the ownership of Athena SWAN has to be wider. There has to be a wider engagement. So this is one way of starting that process early, of getting Athena SWAN out from the Athena SWAN steering group or SAT team meeting room out into the institution. It's a way of getting many eyes, many ideas into the process, and starting to work on the action plan from that point. If you have small working groups or task and finish groups, looking at very, very specific areas of the application, it's a much more efficient use of time. They can really concentrate and focus in a relatively small period of time compared to endless meetings of lots of people over and over. So we found that was a really valuable way to work. And what we asked the working groups to do was to analyse and reflect on the data for a specific area, to identify the main narrative points, to raise comments and questions, and to start generating and formulating actions. Now, those were not necessarily actions that went through to the final application, that went into the ECU, but they were starts. They were a draft and a work in progress. And then what happened was the central team would drew the application together, drafted and refined those actions, etc., and tried to create that application in a single voice. Can't really say it enough. Allow plenty of time to draw up those and refine those actions, to get approval from senior people within the organisation, and then to design the action plan. Okay, next slide, please, Kath. The ECU offer a very basic template for the action plan, obviously taking into account that it needs to be smart, but they're not prescriptive about that. So you can devise your own. I mean, I guess there's only so many versions of an action plan, really. But I'm just showing you here the ones that we used, the headings that we used. Again, you need to be thinking about what's going to make most sense for you in your context. I devised a reference for each action, and those are what we're using to monitor and report against the action, and obviously those related to a particular part of the application. I think the rationale, the milestones, and the success measures are really key in terms of making sure that your action plan is smart. You may think you understand why you're doing an action, but actually writing down the rationale, actually formulating a rationale that's concise, really does concentrate the mind. In terms of lead or responsibility for an action, the panel will be looking for kind of that responsibility is spread out across the institution or the department, depending on the type of application, and that's also important in terms of indicating the buy-in to the action plan as a whole. The key milestones, obviously, standard planning kind of tool, but we found particularly that those where there are quick wins, those are really helpful. They're good for our sense of momentum, and they're good for a sense of reward in feeling that we are making progress in what is obviously a long process and a very wide-ranging process. And the success measures, as goes without saying, and I think James, I'm not going to repeat what James has said, but it's really important to quantify those and to make sure that you are going to be able to evaluate against them. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so BCU is it's a year since our submission of the application. It's 6 months since we got the award, so those are obviously quite nice periods of time in which to be thinking about reporting, reviewing data, time to kind of see how the action plan really is working in practice. And as I said, it is a living document. There are it will need to be responsive to changes within your university or research centre. I mean, between actually since we were awarded the Bronze Award, we have a new VC, and we're about to get a new Equality and Diversity governance within the university. So there's a very significant changes which will need to be reflected, will be bound to be reflected in the way the action plan goes forward. So it's early days for us, but we are, time is ticking away, the clock is ticking away. And I've personally, as the project manager, become very conscious of the multiple ways there are to report on the action plan and on progress. So both the formal measures, which are probably set out in your application anyway, but also more informal ways. And that those informal ways of reporting on an action plan are also a way of growing the visibility of Athena SWAN and growing the engagement and sense of ownership within your institution. And that's all part of the cultural shift. So I think reporting of the action plan needs to be, or progress on the action plan needs to be systemic, but I think you can also be opportunistic. So, for instance, I'm about to later in the year, well, towards the end of the year, I'm going to be talking to our Women's Research Network. I'm going to be talking to our leadership training network within the universities, and those are both going to be opportunities that I'm going to take to talk about where we're, how we're moving forward on the action plan, if there's any particular issues, etc., that are coming up. Something about contextual narrative, again coming back to that fluidity that somebody mentioned. There's always going to be changes in personnel, in resources, in the environment, and therefore in the nature of risks occurring. I'm increasingly recognising the need to maintain a narrative about that sort of in the background, so not part of the action plan, but as the project manager. Just as if I was doing an actual research project, I might keep a research journal or diary, something similar to record the structural changes within the university, personnel changes, those kind of things which impact on Action 5C, because the person that was going to be doing it actually isn't there anymore. There's been a restructure, etc. So just to keep more detail of that as I'm going along, so recording in that sense as well. And supplementary information. Yeah, I've started a good news file, which is really a record of kind of small events, difficult to capture events. Probably wouldn't come up necessarily in the action plan, but changes that I hear about or I see within the university or that people tell me that are reflecting that cultural change. So they are kind of they enrich, I would say enrich the reporting of the action plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, I'm just picking out 6 of the key things I think I've said there. First of all, schedule in plenty of time, more time than you think you need. That the action plan is an integral part of the application. It's absolutely not just an add-on. As a panel member, I have, because we each are at the end of a panel, we are asked to, say yes or no to an individual application, and then depending on the weight of the feeling in the panel, that's where the decision is made. I have personally failed what seemed to be an okay application on the action plan because it wasn't smart, and also I have decided that an award should be given on the basis of a really good action plan, which has come on the back of a pretty mediocre or average application. So they are really important. They are integral. Please be clear in format, structure and language. Ensure your action plan is a living and responsive document. That's probably more in terms of implementation than the actual in the application. I really support the idea of many eyes, many views, and using the action plan as a tool to develop wider engagement. So just as I see Athena SWAN as a tool for that wider cultural shift for gender equality, I see the action plan as a tool within Athena SWAN for that engagement. And keeping track must be systematic, but can also be more narrative, and so that the action plan is a way of continuing the narrative of the Athena SWAN journey. Okay, next slide. That's it. Thank you. Very happy to take questions.
Thanks, Kate. Some very pragmatic advice to people here. I'm sure that they will find it of value. We have got a few questions. If you've got some more questions, please do post them in the questions box. It's a question for you, Kate, but it's kind of related to another question, which I'm not sure whether it would be you or James would answer. So there's a specific question here. Is the BCU Athena SWAN application and action plan available on your university website to review, to look at it as a good practice?
Not yet, but will be by the end of the year.
Okay, so we need to wait a few weeks for that then. It's quite soon now. And then you mentioned earlier in your presentation about, you can see when you're talking about whether to approach an action plan thematically or chronologically, and there's examples of people using colour and boxes. Where do those kind of action plan examples sit? Is that something you know, or is that something we'd need to put to James?
Well, I can certainly say from my point of view, in terms of if it's the signposting the question is talking about, yeah. So we at the end of each section, or if it was a long section, each kind of part of it goes section 4, 4.1, 4.2, etc. At the end of each section, we put a coloured box saying which. Saying the action code or the action reference and what that action was, so that showed the reader what actions were coming out of what part of the section. If that action actually referred to something further down the application or further on in the application, then it was repeated then as well, also in that box. So you would just visually be able to recognise an action from the coloured box.
Okay, and for examples of action plans, best practice action plans from other organisations, be they institutional or department, are they held somewhere? Not necessarily from Birmingham City University. But
I don't know.
James, do you know? Are you able to pitch in there?
He's gone for a cup of tea.
I was going to say, has he gone for a cup of tea or fallen asleep? He's gone for a stiff drink now.
Oh, no. I was just trying to turn my microphone back on. So we expect, as the previous questioner implied, we expect successful applicants to publish their submissions, including the action plans, on their institutional websites, and we're currently looking for a way to reliably link to all known published submissions from our list of members and award holders, which exists on our website, but unfortunately people keep moving them. So the best way is simply to, I think, you can look through our members list to identify who has awards. If you want to look at someone from a similar discipline or a similar type of institution, then Google or look on their website, and in the majority of cases, the application will have been published. Obviously, if there is a delay, and we don't publish them ourselves because a lot of the information in submissions can be quite sensitive. But the expectation is that applicants publish them.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Loads of questions, so quick I can't read them all. This is to you, Kate. So you emphasised the importance of wider engagement. Sorry, questions moved off my screen now. You emphasised the importance of wider engagement. How do you manage disparate levels of engagement?
Sorry, was that how do you manage disparate levels? Yes.
I don't know whether they mean levels as in seniority.
Right. Okay. So that could be taken two ways. It could be either how do you manage the fact that people are some people are engaged and some people aren't, or it could be, as you say, the senior. Gosh. I just keep plugging away. I don't know. I used to have a catering budget, but I don't anymore. So I used to find food was a really, really good way of engaging people. That's a good way to get people along to events, or any type of refreshment is a good way to get people along to events. That's probably not what the questioner was asking, though. Yeah, I think you have to talk to each different interest group, if you like, from their perspective, and also what's really helpful is if you can find a champion within that interest group. Very early on in our process, and this is not particularly related to an action plan, but very early on in our process, I encouraged each faculty to set up a sort of faculty group that could engage with Athena SWAN in whatever way was relevant to them. So, and that was a way of getting faculties or even schools, depending on sizes, to come at Athena SWAN from a local level, and to identify what was most important or most worrying or concerning to them in that discipline, at that level, in that type of role. And that's worked quite well, and I'm now seeing the kind of fruits of that, in that we've got people who have worked really hard to kind of get that moving within faculties and schools. And that's now producing all sorts of offshoots. So I think encouraging local engagement in the way that is meaningful to that group has been one of the most successful things that we've done. And then dealing with the kind of senior buy-in and the the university executive group, etc. Again, it's about going through the appropriate channels. So really, you're perhaps talking about similar things, but you're addressing it in different ways. I don't know if that answers the question. I hope so.
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it would be helpful. This is a question that's come up a couple of times whilst you've been speaking, actually, and it came up at the end of James's as well. Slightly different wording in each case, but has the effectiveness of this process been studied? So they're talking about Athena SWAN now. That is, do Athena SWAN award-holding departments have a better gender balance than others, say 3 or 5 years later?
I'm not aware of that research having been done. I am about to do. I'm preparing some proposals for research into Athena SWAN actually myself, but that's in the future. So I don't know. James might have more definite information about that if he can find his microphone.
James, is there evidence to suggest that having gone through the process, it might have an impact on the gender balance? Oh, can you unmute him, Catherine, please?
Hello, yes. So there have been 2 evaluation reports of Athena SWAN. The most recent one was published in 2014. And it was an independent evaluation conducted by researchers from Loughborough University, and they compared the primary basis of the impact evaluation was comparing a range of metrics for silver award-holding departments compared with departments where there was no award or a bronze award. And given that the silver criteria, in addition to bronze, are that the applicant can demonstrate impact against previously identified challenges, it is in the silver department where we would expect to see evidence of change. And the evaluation report, broadly speaking, did find that there were there's a range of headline findings, which I'm now trying to remember from the top of my head, primarily around women reporting more self-confidence and more visibility within their department as a result of changes that had been introduced. There was definitely some findings about wider acceptance of flexible working. As it regards an actual quantitative boost in gender equality, I don't believe that was a statistically significant finding. But again, in most of these cases, we're talking about short periods of time to achieve silver. We're about to commission a further independent evaluation report, which should be conducted in the next calendar year, which will help improve the business case for the efficacy of Athena SWAN. But outside of, there's I should say, outside of work that we've commissioned, there's two quite recent studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. I think they both focus on Athena SWAN as implemented in medical schools. One is by Caffrey et al., which is Caffrey, and one is of Seiko et al., so that's Ovseiko, and they found in the medical schools specifically, they looked at that there had been a overall positive impact of working on Athena SWAN, although again that was one of the risks that I highlighted at the start of my presentation, in that the work can disproportionately fall to women, was highlighted by both of those studies, and so again, it's there's some things that there's also some useful learning as well as evidence of benefit in those, and then of course there's the broader business case for diversity, which we see in the innovativeness of teams which are more diverse, and so on. I'll find the link to the Loughborough report, and I'll let that be posted with the webinar.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, James. I'm looking back through the questions, and a lot of them I think you've covered in your answers to other questions. Just one come in, I'll just see if it's already been covered or not. Okay, I'm going to read this to make sure I'm not misleading you. It's best to embed equality in current structures rather than set up specific structures, even where women have either no or very little presence. Is that right? Or is it okay to make representation in the structures an action plan element and a change of current structure? Not sure I've read that correctly.
Might have to read it again.
Yes, I know they are the words. I'm not sure whether I just put the emphasis in the right place. So let me try it again. It's best to embed equality in current structures rather than set up specific structures, even where women have either no or very little presence. Is that right? Maybe I'll just leave it at that part.
Shall I start on that one? With that one? I would say yes, it is better to embed equality in current structures rather than set up specific structures or specific additional structures, because I think the problem with specific structures is that, or ones running alongside, is that they're seen as special and extra, and so I think it's the structure, it's the current structure and the system that we're working with that needs to be moved along, and so that's what needs to be made equal. I mean, there's probably an argument that setting up a specific structure might get you there faster in terms of identifying issues, etc. I'm talking very generally here, and then that can feed into current structures. But I would say that it's the system that we are working with that needs to change. Okay, that's my answer.
Makes sense to me. James, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would echo that, and I think it's preferable to be mainstreaming these efforts rather than having them something that sits somewhere over there and may be forgotten.
Yep. Okay. Well, we're coming up to the hour now, so there's no further questions. So thank you both for your insights today, and thank you everyone for staying with us on the call. Hopefully you've found a lot of the content valuable today, and we will be sharing it on the members area of the WISE website later on this week. We'll ensure to include a couple of the links that have been shared in chat around best practices and the Loughborough report that James mentions. We'll add that to the content that we're sharing. So thank you all for attending today, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Bye for now.
Are we off?